Well, here we go. Welcome, class, to the last lecture. I haven't done that many lectures here this quarter online. I do them every single day in class, but I feel I would be remiss if I let you leave this course without some kind of short lecture on the Civil War. You can't understand American history without understanding the Civil War. It is the single most epic event in our history. It was a national bloodletting, taking over 600,000 American lives. Was it worth it? That's for you to decide. It strengthened the Union. It made us the kind of nation that could no longer conceive of having a civil war. It also ended slavery, freeing 4 million African American slaves. And that war lives with us today. It is a very commemorated event to this day. It's much debated. After your document assignment this week, I hope you realize that slavery was in fact a primary cause of the Civil War. So was states' rights. But the issues that involved states' rights also involved the continued right to hold slaves. And in fact, it was the fear that the federal government would not continue to honor that right after the election of Abraham Lincoln that compelled Southerners to decamp from the Union. So there's no way that I can cover the Civil War in a short lecture. So I'm going to focus on two big questions that you can continue to discuss in the discussion this week. And of course, you're going to supplement all of this by reading your book in chapter 13, which I think has a pretty good section about the Civil War and helps to answer these questions as well. The first is, why did the North win? I'm not going to answer this for you completely, but I'm going to give you a bunch of reasons and focus on some important turning points that help you to explain Northern victory, and then you can kind of piece together what your answer is from that. And then the second question is, what did the Civil War achieve? And we'll get to that towards the end of this hopefully short lecture. So I'm going to move pretty quick, and we're going to begin with the first question. And one way to look at that question is to, and I'm going to get a pen going here, is to look at resources. And what you'll see if you look at resources is just a minute here. Okay, sorry, I'm having some problems with my PowerPoint here. Okay, pointer options. Just get rid of pointer, I guess. So anyway, okay. Okay, here we go. I think I've figured it out, and I've still got my pointer going somewhere. Can you see my pointer? Okay. If we look at advantages, if we just look at resources, because one could make the case that it is resources, especially in big wars like the Civil War, that ultimately constitute who will win, ultimately determine who will win. Of course, things aren't always so simple, because if you just use that metric, you could look at a lot of wars throughout history and see that it's not always the most powerful nation that wins. Remember, the American colonists defeated Britain, the most powerful military nation in the world. Remember that the small peasant nation of Vietnam defeated the greatest power in the modern world in the 20th century in the Vietnam War. So it's not always true that you can just take your ledger book and say, look at the North. It's got way more stuff. It can outproduce. It's got more people. It's got more wealth. It's got more railroads. It's got even more agriculture. And here you can look at your book has this this graph, and it sums it up pretty well. I mean, look at this population, right? 60-40. Look at railroad mileage. Okay, everything, farm acreage, even commodity output. And commodity would include livestock. It would include farm production. It would include timber, and of course factories. Look at this: 15% in the South, 85%, and this becomes one of the first industrial wars, really. I mean, how many guns can you produce? Certainly the North has the advantage. So this is one way of answering this question. If you just want to look at this question in terms of resources, you're going to see that the North has a distinct advantage. But the North also has some disadvantages as well. What were they fighting for? To preserve the Union. This has an appeal as an abstract notion, but consider how hard it is to accomplish this strategy from a strategic viewpoint. Right? What do you have to do to achieve this purpose? What do you have to do to preserve the Union? You have to keep these people loyal who do not want to be part of it. So in a sense, the Union, the North, is in the same situation with the South that the British were in with the colonists during the American Revolution. It meant they had to try to keep these people from rebelling. But how do you do that? So this is a really hard thing to achieve, so consider that. The South has a number of advantages. And one advantage that the South has is it's largely fighting a defensive war. Not that it doesn't go on the offensive. We know that Lee charges all the way up into Lee and Longstreet and all those guys charge up into Pennsylvania. But the Battle of Gettysburg. But the desire isn't to sort of capture, the North and capture Northern Territory and take over the North and so forth. The desire from the perspective of the South is to simply make the war keep going on, to fight a war of attrition, that they could drag the war out and exact so much blood and treasure from the North that the North would lose its will to fight. So that's an advantage when you're fighting a defensive war. What do you have to do to win? Simply keep going, defend your territory. What does the Union have to do to win? They have to take you over, destroy you, get you to come back. I think your book actually has a really nice summary of this conflict on page 399. So let me write this up. So your book on page, I can't write, 399. Woo! That's horrible. Sorry, I'm using not my finger, but this mouse, and it's really hard. On page 399, in the section left-hand column, Fighting for Union or Against Slavery, your book says the Union and Confederacy faced very different tasks in the war. The South had to defend its territory and force the federal government to halt military action. The North had to bring the Confederacy to its knees by invading the South and isolating it from potential allies abroad. So again, how do you achieve those aims? And I think that's very hard for the North to achieve its aims. The South, has to defend itself. It's fighting on its home soil. The South also has better military commanders. Almost all the military commanders in the Civil War are from West Point, trained at the military academy, but Lee and people like Stonewall Jackson tend to outmatch their northern companions. So the South has a number of advantages, including, we might argue, this sense of, they're fighting to defend their way of life. They feel very righteous about their way of life, which includes slavery, by the way, as you should recognize from the readings that you've done. They talk a lot about states' rights, and that's I guess a noble thing, to defend local control, to defend the sovereignty of your state. And yet, states' rights is also then a disadvantage to the South. Because how do you fight a war based upon this notion of states' rights? How how do you have the centralization of authority necessary to run a large-scale war, right? If you want to maintain sovereignty and control in local hands at the state level or even below that, rather than at the national level. So we're going to see that the states' rights ideology makes it hard for the South. For example, Southern governors are jealous of the power of the national government, and by this time I'm talking about the CSA, the Confederate States of America. Some of them resist any imposition put on them by the Confederate government for revenue, for taxes, or for troops and supplies. Governor Joseph Brown of Georgia, for instance, says, "I entered into this revolution to contribute my might to sustain the rights of states and to prevent the consolidation of government." But if World War II and wars like it are an example, sometimes it's helpful to have a lot of centralized control to create a powerful momentum and to organize and administrate and prosecute a large-scale war. This is, what America does, for example, in, World War I and World War II. So this is a tough thing. Also in the South, you begin to have opposition to draft laws and to conscription by the lower classes especially. The Confederacy allowed men to hire substitutes, including their slaves. By 1863, it costs about $600 in gold to get someone to fight for you in the South. And this led to the phrase, "It was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight." And you have growing resentment among the poor, yeoman, non-slave-holding farmers that this war is being fought to protect the rich planters and their slave society, but not really the rights of these poor yeoman dirt farmers. So that's a problem. The South also has economic problems. You saw that they were outmatched by the North in terms of resources, and we're going to see, just like the Continental Army during the American Revolution, that the Southern Army and the Southern nation is going to have economic problems. They're going to have inflation because of printed money with nothing behind it. They're going to have problems with trade. They're an exporting power, but their ports are going to be blockaded by northern naval blockades. It's going to be a tough go economically for the South. So then overall our picture is this, that in the South, the national strategy is defend your political borders, and how are you going to do that? How are you going to carry that out from a military perspective? You're going to just defend your territory, and you're going to focus on this idea of attrition, right? That you're going to try to maximize your opponent's casualties. Of course, that's what everyone does. Minimize your own, of course. But your goal, again, is not to go up and conquer the North, but simply hope that the Union casualties and a prolonged stalemate are going to erode confidence and support for the war in the North. And indeed, all the way up until midway through 1863, this seems to be working from a Southern perspective. And we'll get to that in a second. The Northern strategy is much harder. Again, it's preserve the territorial and governmental integrity of the United States. Again, how do you do that? That's the question. These people want to secede. They want to leave the Union. How do you get them to stay? How do you get them to come back? And the North begins with the idea that this doesn't have to be an all-out war. Lincoln plans at first for this kind of limited war, the Anaconda Plan. Like a snake, the North is going to sort of impose a blockade of southern ports, cut off the South, encircle the South, and wait for resistance to die down, basically impose economic sanctions. That's one strategy. However, that's not going to work in the end, and pretty quickly people in the North are going to realize that the Southerners are serious about this, and this is going to be a long, protracted struggle, and in the end, Northerners, both military and civilian leaders, recognize that total war will have to be waged, nothing less than an unconditional surrender of the South, that the North is going to have to defeat the South as a society. They're going to have to abolish slavery, break Southern resistance, and so forth. This is going to be a larger war than some people believed in the first days, in the first weeks and months of war. Well, here's a picture of the first Battle of Bull Run, also called Manassas, which is going to occur on July 1st, 1861. It's one of the first major engagements. The reason why I mention this, and I can't go through a blow-by-blow account, I need to kind of move on and hit some high points and so forth, but just that people walked out from Washington, D.C. with picnic baskets to sit up on the hillside and watch this war. There was no conception of how bloody and horrible the Civil War would be, but this begins to give some people an idea. This actually shows, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Stonewall Jackson. This is Stonewall Jackson. He's leading a sort of rebel a charge that's repelling the Northern advance. In fact, this is where he gets his name. Stonewall Jackson stands for there stands Jackson like a stone wall, and this is where the Confederates issue their rebel yell, and the Northerners retreat, and 800 men are killed, and people who came with picnic baskets are trying to make it out of the way without themselves dying, and so forth. Just the idea here is that people, I think, have an unrealistic conception of how brutal this war is really going to be, and I'm just going to mention some high points and turning points here. That in the first couple of years of war, the Southerners are scoring, and under the leadership of Lee and Stonewall Jackson, especially the Shenandoah Valley campaign, where Jackson scores a number of major victories, the South has the upper hand. George McClellan, who's the general of the Northern Army, Army of the Potomac, he's not really engaging the Confederates. He's training up his troops real well and marching them around, but he doesn't take advantage of opportunities he has to engage the enemy. And if you look at this map your book gives you can see this is a picture of the early war, and if you look at Confederate victories versus Union victories, and you come up here, you're going to see a lot more, see my circle here, of Confederate victories than there are Union victories in the early years of this war. And so, indeed, this whole idea is of that this is a limited war, that we can impose some blockades. Of course, here are this idea of blockading the ports, right? That we can impose Union naval power to starve the South, and that this is going to be a short war, and they're going to come back and say they're sorry and rejoin the Union. Well, it's not going to happen. And the war very quickly is becoming bloody, demoralizing, protracted, and so forth. The Union is waiting for a victory. They finally get that victory at Shiloh. And again, these are some important, just high points that I'm mentioning. But that victory comes at an incredible cost. It is, for the time, the bloodiest battle in American history, with more men dying on those days in April 6th and 7th, 1862, than all Americans who had been killed in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. So this is an incredibly bloody war, bloody battle. Your book, which I'm trying to look through right now, I have it on my iPad, and my iPad's not going very fast. So I'm trying to get to this quote by, let's see, wow. Okay, well this is being unsuccessful because I can't somehow page through. Okay, there, I finally got it. after the Battle of Shiloh, General Grant, and he's quoted, I'm reading from page 402 in your text, just to give you the idea that your textbook has some good stuff in it. He says, I saw an open field so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping only on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground. So really, really brutal casualties piling up at Shiloh, and no one could think by April 1862 that this war was going to be a limited war, that this war was not going to just continue and be a horrible and long bloody conflict. So by the summer of 1862, there's growing despair in the North. Here's a recruiting station. There's draft riots, actually. People are beginning to sour on the idea of the war. It's at this time, by the summer of 1862, that Lincoln realizes he needs to change from his idea of a limited war to an all-out total war. It's in July of 1862 that the Congress, and the U.S. Congress, of course, just northern states remain in Congress. Well, there are 4 loyal slaveholding states that do remain in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and then later, Tennessee secedes, but later they're essentially under Union control. But okay, anyway, it's in the summer of 1862 that the Congress, again, which is essentially a Northern Congress by this time, passes a law which allows the confiscation of Southern property obtained in the war, including slaves. It's at this point that Lincoln seizes on emancipation as a necessary wartime strategy. So we should recognize that emancipation occurs within a military context as well as a humanitarian context. So Lincoln is waiting for a big victory in order to declare his Emancipation Proclamation. He finally gets his victory at Antietam in 1862. Here again, this was the bloodiest. Now this supersedes Shiloh. It becomes the bloodiest single day in American history. Actually, I believe all the way up to D-Day. It may still even be above D-Day. The Federals lost 2,000 dead, 10,000 wounded. The rebels, the Confederates, lost 2,700, over 8,000 wounded. Actually, this was way more, if you look at those totals, than D-Day. In fact, because both sides are Americans, it's more than double what happened on D-Day. So still today, Antietam, I believe, is the largest single bloody day in American history. Some regiments lose over 50% of their men. Horrible, horrible victory. And in the North, there's still a lot of discontent. But things change in 1863, and I want to talk now about 1863, and these are the final points I'll make as I take us to the end of the war and trying to, again, give you as much food for thought to piece together this answer. Why does the North win? How does the North win? What goes into that? Let's look at some of these big turning points in 1863. The first is the Emancipation Proclamation is issued on January 1st, 1863. So even though we could say that Lincoln had started the war to preserve the Union, it soon became clear to all involved that the war now had emancipation as one of its primary goals, and this could not be doubted after the declaration by Lincoln on January 1st that slaves in all rebel states would be, quote, thenceforth and forever free. What this does is it imbues the war with a greater sense of purpose, of morality, making the war also about freedom, about liberty, of defeating oppression. and promoting liberty. There's a huge strategic aspect to this as well, because slavery provided the backbone of the Southern economy, and therefore it had to be destroyed as a strategic measure. Also, the proclamation would induce more slaves to escape, and by 1863 to serve as soldiers in the Union Army. Many of them are going to escape, make their way to Union lines where they found asylum. The Union Army begins to enlist former slaves and just African Americans generally, free and slave. Nearly 180,000 African Americans are going to serve in the Union Army, and by war's end, an estimated 100,000 of them are former slaves, the point that I just made up there. So this is, I think, a revolutionary turn that what's happening in the Northern Army, because a lot of the Northern infantrymen, they're not and haven't been really fighting to end slavery, but this changes things and changes the context of the war. The war still drags on. The war into 1863 is bloody. The South is still having some major victories, but another major turning point occurs at Gettysburg in 1863 when George Meade's Union Army of 85,000 men meets Lee's force of 70,000 men in southern Pennsylvania. Again, I can't go into, we can't talk about Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill and the big and little round tops and, the different troop movements and things like this. Let's just say that that Lee makes some strategic blunders, primarily sending Pickett to on the third day of battle to attack the center of the Union lines, and Pickett sets off, and here you can see Pickett's charge right here. Here's the Union line on the high ground up at Cemetery Ridge, and 13,000 men set off, and half of them are going to be killed or captured immediately. This is a great turning point of the war. Why did Lee believe his troops could attack the Union center and win? We don't know, but this is maybe the moment that the war is lost. About the same time, if we go west into Mississippi, into the Western Theater, south and west from Gettysburg, in July 1863, another major turning point, and that is Grant leads the victory. It's been a 6-week-long siege that he's laid to Vicksburg, but once, and here's Vicksburg right here, once Grant defeats the Confederates at Vicksburg, the Union Army has taken control over all the Mississippi River Valley. This is hugely important, not only for transportation and navigation, but also by cutting the South in half, right? The western southern states, Texas and those over there, Louisiana, are now cut off from the eastern portion of the Confederacy. This is huge and very, very important in terms of explaining the Northern victory. So that's Vicksburg in July of 1863. The other thing that happens at Vicksburg is that Ulysses S. Grant emerges then as Lincoln's primary man to carry out the war. Lincoln has been looking for someone to take the war to the South. And Grant emerges as his man. And it is Grant then who initiates his strategy of total war, carried out by himself as well as William Tecumseh Sherman here, who then really take the campaign to the South. I mean, Sherman's campaign in Georgia is the sort of perfect example. Here's Ulysses S. Grant. Here is Grant at Cold Harbor. Again, a very, very bloody, horrible, and you could say it's a Confederate victory. The Union loses more men, but really it's at this point that Grant is bleeding the Confederate Army, forcing them to take more and more casualties and keeping the pressure on, something that McClellan and previous generals of the Union Army have not been able to do. It's this process then now of moving into the South, down to Atlanta, right, which falls in 1864, and then Sherman's march from Atlanta to Savannah to the Gulf, which really virtually guarantees Lincoln's re-election and also this northern victory. This is a 250-mile march to Savannah, and in it Sherman, in his actions, makes real this concept of total war. It's said, I don't know if this is true, that Sherman actually was the one who coined the phrase "war is hell." I always thought that was just a self-evident truth. But under Sherman, certainly war was hell. He initiated a scorched earth policy on the South. He said, quote, "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. We cannot change the hearts of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible, make them so sick of war that generations would pass that they would again appeal to it." And so indeed, not only defeating the army, Sherman's men destroy railroad tracks, pillage, plunder, burn, cut a 50-mile swath through the South of destruction, where the slaves join in and so forth. Of course, Southerners to this day have not forgotten Sherman, and the name still can conjure up deep feelings in the South. So I think I've given you enough on why and how the North wins the Civil War. The second question, and this is going to be very short, I hope, you guys, I know I need to finish this up, is about the consequences of war. And you can stop the thing, right? You can pause, you can go do something else and listen to this part later or something like that. Don't need to keep you listening to me for too long. And I really do believe that lectures are far better in the classroom, but I still feel compelled to give you a little lecture about the Civil War, which is so important. In terms of consequences, well, there are so many. I mean, really, one is that, the South is devastated, right? The South is, the South is devastated. The Southern elite is destroyed, Southern infrastructure is destroyed, Southern industry is destroyed, Southern wealth is destroyed. The South has been defeated and humiliated. But this war that cost so many lives resolved two great fundamental questions. The first question is, would the Republic survive, or would it collapse into tyranny, revolution, civil wars? The answer, of course, is that we would survive with a Republican form of government, and since 1865, no state or region has sought to secede from the Union. I mean, has really made an actual attempt to. There's always some chatter recently from the state of Texas about secession, but there was a lot of true efforts towards secession in the early republic, and a lot of people throughout the world and in Europe were just simply waiting for this experiment in republicanism and democracy to crumble, to collapse, and it did a handful of times in the 1820s, in the 1830s, and of course during the Civil War, and yet after the Civil War the nation was reunited, and we haven't devolved into that kind of conflict since, and that's really a remarkable thing. If you look at other places in the world, if you look at places like Iraq and all through the Middle East, and if you look at places like Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, and all the places that have been subject to fighting between religious groups and regional groups and ethnic groups, it's really remarkable that we have held together as a nation since the Civil War. Of course, the other big question was slavery. And slavery was finally abolished. 4 million slaves were freed. The meaning and dimensions of freedom would still continue to challenge Americans. But slavery was done. The question of equal citizenship, I think, would come later. There were a number of amendments that were passed that addressed equal citizenship. There were There was a Civil Rights Act of 1866. There was the 14th Amendment that extends citizenship and all the privileges and immunities of citizenship to those born in the U.S. But that wasn't really backed up for about 100 years, really until the Civil Rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The 14th Amendment was largely disregarded throughout the South as, in fact, blacks were denied equal protection under the law. And the 14th Amendment, by the way, is known as there's the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. And blacks were denied equal protection under the law in the South for over 100 years. So it's hard to say, did things change immediately? Well, no, they didn't, but the preconditions were laid and these amendments were created that I think later are going to be the edifice upon which people strive for their rights. The 15th Amendment, of course, forbade states and the federal government to deny any citizen suffrage on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, extending the vote to blacks. But again, blacks don't get the vote in practical terms until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, some blacks do, some blacks don't, but most African Americans are denied the vote all the way up until the 1960s. In the South, I'm talking about the South. And yet, these amendments are here, and these amendments stipulate, you can read these amendments in the back of your book, that states will not be the arbiter of citizenship and equality. And that wasn't the case. Up until this time, states could determine who was going to be a citizen. And states can still determine who's going to vote in their state. If felons can vote and some things like that. But ultimately, states no longer have control over these big issues of citizenship and ensuring equal protection and equality. Those are things that are going to be constitutionally protected for people in all the states. Well, guys, I'm going to leave it at that. There are a lot of consequences, and amazing and long-lasting consequences that come out of the Civil War. You can think for yourself whether you believe the Civil War was worth it or not. Some people argue, as I saw a letter to the editor in the Tri-City Herald just the other day, arguing that, we should have just allowed the South to secede and shouldn't have, killed all these people in fighting this war simply to get the South to become remain part of the Union. So there's all kinds of interesting debates. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've learned something this quarter, and let me say that if you have, it's thanks to you, because I think that in a distance class like this, it's really the student and the independent and self-determined effort of students to learn and to take their education into their own hands that really amounts to something. And so thank you if you learned something. I really hope you did. And I'm sorry that we couldn't have been in the class and had the questions and answers and the back and forth, because I think there's something very dynamic and fundamental about teaching in a classroom. But you know what? Many of you probably read more than my students in class, and all of you practically wrote more than my students in class. So I think you learned some things, and I hope you did, and I enjoyed the class, and good luck with the rest of your education.